is a great honor to be asked to contribute to this seminar, and it's also an honor to be asked to start it. But in fact, I think it makes some sense that we start with this lecture because the historical background is extremely important in the issues that you're going to be considering over the coming week. And historically, this is what the whole thing starts with. It starts with the history of Zionism. I am going to talk about three things for about 45 minutes. I'm going to talk about the origins of Zionism. I'm going to talk about the development of Zionism over the period since the foundation of the State of Israel. And then I am going to talk about the current status and bring what we have heard from the very beginning into the present day. What I'm talking about is history. I find, I'm trained as a historian, I find that history is extremely useful in explaining how and why things happen. History is often not terribly useful in helping us make moral judgments of any sort. And one thing that I'm not going to be doing today is making moral judgments on one side or the other. And I think actually that one of the things we'll see is that we go so far back in the history that some of the moral questions that are being raised today just don't really fit into earlier periods. But that is the only thing I'm going to say on the subject of morality. Before I get going, I just want to establish the difference in meaning between the two crucial terms, Jewish and Zionist. To be Jewish relates essentially to a religion, which is why I put the Torah scrolls up here. Whereas to be Zionist relates to a political position. As we'll see, the basic idea of Zionism is the establishment of a home for the Jews, of a Jewish state, which is a political position and a political action. There were Jews before there were ever Zionists, and although many Jews today are Zionists, there are Jews who are not Zionists. And as we will see, rather strangely, the earliest Zionists were not actually Jews, they were Christians. And there are still Christian Zionists today. And in principle, I think we can have a Hindu Zionist if we want to. So they are very distinct. They overlap, and the overlap is extremely important, but they are very distinct. Having said that, we will actually see during the course of this talk that it sometimes gets a bit more complicated than that. But even so, the basic distinction between these two terms is very important. So we will start with the first part of my talk on the origins of Zionism. And the earliest Zionists that can be identified are two English Protestants in the 17th century. And at this time, the term Zionist was not used. The term that was used instead is the term that we see in the book on the right, restoration, the restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land. Now, of course, as we all know, Judaism started in what is sometimes called the Holy Land or Palestine or Judea. There are several terms for the geographical area. And as we also know, during the Roman period, the temple was destroyed and the Jews dispersed. In the standard Jewish understanding at this time, when these two books were published, the Jews would return to Israel when the Messiah appeared. And of course, the appearance of the Messiah in Jewish, Christian, and in slightly different version in the Muslim understanding is something that happens at the end of time. Now, for the Jews in this period, the dispersal had happened, exile had happened, and the proper thing to do was to wait in exile wherever one was until the Messiah came and returned the Jews to the Holy Land, or returned the Holy Land to the Jews. But the idea developed among certain Protestant theologians, including the two that we see here, that the coming of the millennium, the return of Jesus, the coming of the perfect world at the end of time could be hastened by changing the sequence. So in the Jewish understanding, the Messiah comes and then the Jews return. But in this Protestant understanding, if the Jews can be returned, then the Messiah will come. So this is a millenarian movement of the 17th century among Christians, which this was a period when there were many millenarian ideas around, and these ideas were sufficiently popular to be debated in the English Parliament under Cromwell. The result of it was not that the Jews were restored to Palestine, but that the Jews were allowed to return to England, from which they had previously been expelled. So it did result in a certain change, but not the one that these theologians intended. The theology here, as I say, at the period it was called Restorationism rather than Zionism. Today it is called Christian Zionism. And the idea is essentially the same, that the return of the Jews to Israel is the precursor for the Christian millennium and the rule of justice and God and so forth. It should be said that at this point in the early 17th century, nobody thought of asking the Jews what they thought about this idea. This was a purely internal Christian English discussion. Now, the next thing that happens, excuse me, the next things that happens is one of the most important events in global history, which is the French Revolution. And with the French Revolution, we shift from a world which is structured around loyalty to kings and princes to a world which is, in theory at least, structured around the individual citizen as citizen. Whoever they are, if they are a citizen, they are the same as any other citizen. Now, this, in the case of Napoleon, included the Jews. And here we see an illustration of the Emperor Napoleon giving religious freedom to French Jews on condition that they accepted being ordinary citizens of France. So this was a two-way deal. You get freedom, says Napoleon to the Jews, but you have to do your part as citizens. You have to turn up and fight in the army. And there was a question actually put to them by Napoleon. If you find yourself opposite an English Jew, where will your loyalty be? Will you fight the English Jew because you are a Frenchman, or will you spare the English Jew because he is a Jew, in which case you are not really a Frenchman? So, of course, the correct answer was to say, Your Imperial Majesty, we will, of course, fight the English Jews because we are French citizens. So this is how the new world was meant to be. It was meant to be a world of equality and of the nation. And the idea of the nation is extremely important here. We'll come back to it in a second. Now, of course, it didn't quite work out like that. And less than 100 years after Napoleon grants freedom and equality to the Jews, we have the case of Captain Dreyfus. And this is an event that completely divides France. Captain Dreyfus is an officer in the French army, and he is a Jew. And somebody, French intelligence discover, has leaked the plans of a French fort to the Germans. So there is an investigation to discover who has leaked these plans. And the investigation discovers that one of the people who had access to these plans was Captain Dreyfus, who was a Jew. So clearly it must have been him, because he wasn't a real Frenchman, was he? You can't trust the Jews. And on the basis of very little evidence, Dreyfus is convicted by the court, as we see here, and some people, including an Austrian journalist by the name of Herzl, who we will meet in a few minutes, some people conclude that despite the theoretical equality and toleration granted to the Jews, the Christian majority in Europe was never, ever going to accept the Jews, really. Captain Dreyfus was later, some more evidence turned up, which made it completely clear that it had not been Dreyfus who had sold these plans to the Germans. It had been another French officer, and Dreyfus was pardoned, but he carried on. He was restored to the French army, but I think the damage for him had been done. So what we get at about this period in the 19th century is what is called the Jewish question. And this is a question which is discussed very much in Germany for purely geographical reasons, because there are more Jews in Germany and on the edge of Germany than anywhere else. And also because German is at that point a major international language. And here we have one of the main texts written by a person called Bruno Bauer on Die Judenfrage, the Jewish question. And this is part of a discussion which Bauer is part of, which Karl Marx is part of. Bauer was not himself a Jew. So again, this is, as we saw with the earlier Christian Zionism, this is Europeans talking about the Jews rather than asking themselves what they thought about this and what they wanted. So we have a certain amount of discussion like this book here in German, and we also have a very interesting novel by George Eliot. George Eliot, one of the great novelists in the English language of the late 19th century, who was, of course, this was a pen name, and she was in fact a woman. And one of her novels is about a character called Daniel Deronda, who is a Jew but doesn't realize it, and during the course of the novel discovers that he is a Jew. And the end of this novel is a discussion of precisely the Zionist idea, that the Jews need, the Jews are a nation, just like the French or the English, and they need a state of their own, just like the French or the English. And this is, of course, a period of nationalism, when new nations are suddenly appearing. The Romanians decide that they're a nation and they need a state. The Bulgarians decide that they're a nation and they need a state. So the idea here that the Jews are a nation and they need a state, one of the earliest developments of this idea in a novel by an English writer, who of course was not a Jew either. But don't worry, finally somebody's going to ask the Jews what they think. And here we have one of the earliest expressions of what will become Zionism. And it's a book by a German Jew called Moses Hess. And as you see, the title is Rome and Jerusalem, the Last National Question. So what's the national question? The national question is, should the Romanians have a state? Should the Bulgarians have a state? Does every people need a state? And what Hess is arguing here is that the Jews are a people, are a nation, and that they need a state. So this is, I mean, there are other discussions, but this book by Hess, published in 1862, is in some ways the first major expression of the Zionist idea, but not the most important expression. The most important expression is produced by Theodor Herzl, who we see here. And Theodor Herzl was an Austrian, he was an Austrian journalist. I mean, he was also a lawyer. And he had covered the Dreyfus trial for the Austrian press. And in this very short book, it's called a book, but in many ways it's almost a pamphlet on the Jewish state, which is subtitled A Proposal for a Modern Solution to the Jewish Question. In this book, he makes a number of clear and centrally important assertions. One of them is that the Europeans are never going to accept the Jews. And why are they never going to accept the Jews? Because the Jews are different. And why are the Jews different? Because they do not have a state of their own. They are a people without a state. What then is the solution? Well, the Jews should have a state. And how is this solution going to come about? And here is a central part as well, that Herzl says that the Jewish question is an international question, which means that the international community, as we call it today, then it was the world powers, they have got to sort out this question. Now, this was not unreasonable in 1896 because the question of Romanian independence and Bulgarian independence and all these other national questions had indeed generally been sorted out at an international level with the participation of the world powers. So, Herzl is important for expressing these positions very clearly and convincingly, and also for developing a practical plan, and then for implementing it. Herzl set up, the year after he published this book, he set up the Zionist Congress. And here they are meeting in Switzerland in 1897, and these are Jews who are accepting Herzl's idea of establishing a Jewish state for the Jewish people. Not all Jews were in favor of this idea. On the left here, we see what are called Haredim. They are the ultra-Orthodox. They are Jews who have not accepted modernity, have not agreed to dress up in 19th century costume, have not agreed to get doctorates in law and write in the Austrian newspapers. They are determined to carry on being old-fashioned Jews, in their terms, proper Jews. And so far as they are concerned, the Jews shall return to Palestine when the Messiah comes, and not before. So these are non-Zionist Jews, and we still have non-Zionist Jews today, who regard Zionism as blasphemous and heretical. There was also Rav Kook, who we see on the right, Abraham Isaac Kook, who was both an Orthodox Jew. Herzl wasn't. Herzl was completely secular. Herzl never went anywhere near a synagogue unless he absolutely had to. But Kook is a religious Jew, an Orthodox Jew, but he rather likes the Zionist idea. And he comes up with a sort of theological trick almost to justify Zionism in religious terms. And his idea is that, of course, the Jews shall not return to Palestine until the coming of the Messiah, but perhaps if they sort of prepared things a bit for the Messiah to come, that would be okay. So that basic logic produces what we call religious Zionism. So that is the end of the first part of this. And we have here three forms of Zionism. We have Christian Zionism, we have Herzl Zionism, the Zionism of the Zionist Congress, which is secular. It's about nationalism. And then also we have, with Rav Kook, religious Zionism, which is messianic, and is sometimes called Messianic Zionism as a result. The Christian Zionism, of course, is also messianic in various ways. But at this stage, the central operation is Herzl's Zionism, which is not messianic, is purely secular, and is following the idea of the nation established during the French Revolution. So where do we go from here? The question that arises immediately is, well, where should this Jewish state be located? And initially, there are three ideas being proposed. One of them is Palestine, one of them is Patagonia, and one of them is Uganda. And the idea that at one point is the leading idea is the idea of Uganda, which the British proposed to Herzl, because Herzl and the other Zionists have been running around Europe requesting meetings with foreign ministers and so forth, and saying, look, Jewish question, international question, please solve it, give us a state. And the British say, what about Uganda? We're short of settlers for Uganda. It's actually not working out very well. It's costing us lots of money, and we're not making any money. It would be absolutely great if the Jews decided to settle in Uganda, because they develop the place and we get lots of money, and it's a win-win situation. Herzl is in favor of the Ugandan plan because he's a secular Jew. He couldn't care less where the Jewish state is located, so long as there is a Jewish state. But the majority in the Zionist Congress do not like this idea and instead insist on Palestine. Patagonia was also considered for a while. And of course, the advantages of both Patagonia and Uganda at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is that people are settling there. Europeans are settling there. Uganda, not that many, nobody much wanted to go to Uganda. But in this period, South America, Argentina, and Patagonia, shiploads of Italians are turning up. Shiploads of Germans are turning up. The Welsh are turning up. Everybody is turning up. So the idea that some Jews could turn up as long as the Germans, and they're in Patagonia, there are places where people are speaking German. And in this period, there are still places where people speak Welsh. So the idea that as well as a German town over there where people are speaking German, we could have a Jewish town over there where people are speaking Hebrew seems a perfectly normal idea at the time. Palestine is not somewhere where people are turning up and settling in this period, because apart from anything else, it's part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is very aware of what the Zionists are trying to do, and the last thing they want is to have them establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. So although there are some Jews moving to Palestine in this period, the Ottoman authorities are doing their best to keep the numbers as low as possible and prevent any sort of Jewish state being established in Palestine. Because as far as they are concerned, it's theirs. It's part of the Ottoman Empire. They don't want other people establishing states in the Ottoman Empire. Everything changes, however, in 1917 during the First World War, because the British take Palestine during the war from the Ottomans. And the question arises of what is going to happen with these territories after the war. And the British are being a bit unscrupulous in this period, and they're promising anything to anybody in order to get some support. So bits of West Asia have been promised to the French, bits have been promised to the Hashemite family in the Hijaz, and bits of it here are now being sort of promised to the Zionists. Now, this is one of the most famous documents ever, but if you read it very carefully, the language is a bit strange. His Majesty's government, the central paragraph in the middle I'm reading now, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. Does it say a state? No, it says a national home. What is a national home? Frankly, nobody knows. But this is a sort of diplomatic fudging the issue so that everybody can be sort of happy with this, because nobody really knows what it means, so everybody can think that it reflects their views. It then carries on, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Well, if anybody can manage to achieve that, of course, this is the whole problem. It's completely impossible. Or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That one is interesting because there was a concern that Western governments might say to the Jews, okay, you've got a national home in Palestine, bye-bye, off you go. And there was one member of the British cabinet at this period who was himself a Jew, and he was very much against this idea, largely because he was very happy in England and was a successful English politician. And the last thing he wanted was anybody telling him that he had to go home to Palestine. Anyhow, this document is issued and the implementation of it begins. And on the left, we have a collection of British officials and soldiers and Zionists setting out to establish a national home. And on the right, we have some Jewish settlers in an early kibbutz because they were socialist and they wanted to build a new world based on socialism, and off we go. Now, you may wonder, what about the Arabs? Well, nobody had really been focusing on the Arabs. In 1919, there were some contacts between Chaim Weizmann, who was the leading, the Herzl was now dead, Weizmann was the leading Zionist figure, who, as you can see, has put on an Arab headdress in order to sort of show how positive he is about the Arabs. And Amir Faisal al-Hashimi, who is the son of the Hashemite to whom the British had promised certain areas, who then ends up later as the king of Iraq. His cousins take Jordan. But there are attempts at the beginning to make some sort of political arrangement, but it doesn't really work. And by 1936, the Arab inhabitants of Palestine have got so fed up with all this that we see the Arab revolt. And here we see some Palestinian Arabs actually posing for a photograph, but there was a certain amount of very bitter fighting between the Palestinians and the British authorities in Palestine. This gets us to 1939, when the British have all sorts of inquiries and discussions, and they end up publishing this white paper on Palestine in 1939, which basically cancels the Balfour Declaration. It says clearly it is not the policy of His Majesty's government that Palestine should become a Jewish state. But it's a bit too late. This very short summary of what is going on in the Palestine Mandate gives rise to a new variety of Zionism. We have Chaim Weizmann here on the left, who is really following Herzl's line and is the majority leader of the Zionists, who regards Zionism as an international question to be solved really by relying on the British, and who has also accepted the British idea of cutting the Palestine Mandate in half. There develops a minority view led here by Zev Jabotinsky, who is what is called revisionist Zionism. And he doesn't trust the British. He says, we cannot rely on the British. We have to take matters into our own hands. And here, yes, I'm going to have to get out of the way. He establishes two organizations. One of them is Betar, which is a sort of Zionist street movement where people dress up in uniforms and do military tactics in the street. And the other one is Irgun, which, as you can see here, features a rifle. And Jabotinsky is clear that rather than just sitting there and waiting for the international community to solve the problem, the Zionists will need to use force, take matters into their own hands and use force. And if you look on the behind the rifle on Irgun's crest, there is a map. And the map, as you see, is the map of the whole of the Palestine Mandate, not just the western part of it that has become Palestine. So as far as Jabotinsky is concerned, he disagrees with Weizmann, firstly, about the territory, and secondly, about the means to be used. So the State of Israel then comes into being, as we know, in 1948, after the British withdrawal. And at this point, we have now got 4 varieties of Zionism: Christian Zionism, Herzl Zionism, and religious Zionism, and now a new variety, the tough, active Zionism established by Jabotinsky. Now, these 3, well, the Christian Zionism isn't terribly important in this period. The other 3 all develop into political parties. And the original Herzl Zionism develops into a party called Mapai. And as you can just about see, there are workers and peasants supporting things. So this is really quite socialist. The religious Zionism develops into what's called Hapoel HaMizrahi. And here we have the tablets of the law and the hammer. So here we are being Zionist and socialist and religious, and then revisionist Zionism develops into the Irgun. So let us now move on to the present day, or more recent developments at least, after the foundation of the State of Israel. 1949, in some ways, it seems that there is no longer any need for Zionism because the Zionist project has been achieved. There is a Jewish state. It has slightly less territory than the revisionists would have liked, because part of that territory has been occupied by Jordan, as you see here, and also a tiny little bit around Gaza has been occupied by Egypt. But after 1949, for almost 20 years, the questions have all been answered. There's, as I said, there's a Jewish state. It's internationally recognized. It has a Jewish majority and achieved. Things then get much more complicated because in 1967, and then again in 1973, there are wars with surrounding Arab countries, during the course of which Israel extends the territory under its control. And as you will see here, in 1973, not only the part that was part of part of Palestine, which had become part of Jordan, is under Israeli control, but so is a little bit of Syria up in the top right-hand corner, and so is the whole of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, this completely changes the equation, because this vast area here, or this much larger area, I can't say vast area when I'm talking to people in India, can I? This much larger area contains a large Arab population. So what on earth are we going to do about this? And here comes the problem, because some people say we were perfectly okay as things were in 1949. Let's go back to that position. And some people say, no, God has given us this area through some sort of a miracle, so it is our duty to keep it. It is our duty to settle it. And here, the maps of the Jewish settlements in these territories that were conquered in 67 and 73. These maps get very, very quickly out of date. But as you can see on this map, and there are dozens of other maps of different periods and so forth, what is actually happening here is that the settlers in the settlement movement are establishing facts on the ground. That whilst other people are arguing about what we're going to do with these territories, because, you know, on the one hand, it's nice to have the territory, but on the other hand, we don't really want the Arabs, a settlers movement is establishing settlements in these areas designed to cut the areas up and to make it impossible for them to be given away or given back to anybody else. So, during this period, Israeli politics changes dramatically. Initially, what was initially the party of Weizmann and, in a sense, Herzl, Mapai, changes its name to the Labour Party. And this is the top row we're looking at here. And for a long time, the Labour Party is the dominant party. It's the establishment party, it's winning the elections, it's running the governments, it's providing the prime ministers. But as you can see from the graph, suddenly for the Labour Party, it all goes wrong. And over the period between 1969, when they get their highest vote, and today, they keep losing votes and they keep losing elections. Until today, they still exist, but they're of no real relevance. So what happens instead? Who gets these votes? Who takes over as the dominant party? It's the revisionist Zionists. Irgun becomes a party called Herut, which, as you can see, keeps the symbol, keeps the gun, and keeps the rather large map. And then Herut becomes a party called the Likud, and the Likud is led by Benjamin Netanyahu, with whom we are all familiar. Now, one thing that also happens in this period, it's not just the Labour Party losing support and the Likud gaining support, there is also coming into being in 2012 a party called Yesh Atid, which means there is a future. And Yesh Atid defines itself as liberal. Liberal what? Liberal Zionist. What do they mean by Zionist? They're not too worried about the Zionist bit. They're more worried about the liberal bit. What do they mean by liberal? They mean the sort of views and policies that a normal, meaning non-religious, Israeli, secular Israeli will like. They want liberal economics, none of this socialist stuff. They want gay rights, just like the rest of the West. They want to be a sort of normal Western party. So to a certain extent, Yesh Atid replaces Labour Zionism. Three issues then come up during this period. Three withdrawals, or possible withdrawals. One of them is the withdrawal from the Sinai, which happens. Another one is the partial withdrawal from the West Bank, which is the centerpiece of the Oslo agreements, which there is some people like the idea very much, and some people really, really do not like the idea. including Likud and Mr. Netanyahu. And some people like the idea of getting out of the Gaza Strip at least, and some people don't, including Mr. Netanyahu. So we have one withdrawal that happens in Sinai, one withdrawal that happens in Gaza, and a withdrawal in the West Bank that never actually happens at all. So this brings us to today, and here we see the current cabinet with Mr. Netanyahu and Happy in the front row, and the members of this cabinet, the parties represented in this cabinet, as you can see from the chart, they are mostly revisionist Zionists, Likud and some other parties taking that position. And if they're not religious, revisionist Zionists, they are religious Zionists. And then there's a group of other. But the religious Zionists are, in some cases, quite radical. And here we see Bezalel Smotrich, who is currently the Minister of Finance. He is a religious Zionist. His party identifies as religious Zionist. He is a religious Zionist. He is himself a settler. So that's two things coming together there. He was unenthusiastic about the withdrawal from Gaza, and during the withdrawal, he was found by the police with 700 liters of gasoline. And quite what he was going to do with the 700 liters of gasoline, we never discovered, because he was arrested and they were confiscated. But presumably he, like Irgun, thought that a bit of direct action was called for here. Since being appointed Minister of Finance, he has cut funding to the Palestinian Authority because he doesn't think there should be a Palestinian Authority of any variety in the West Bank, let alone Gaza. And his position on Gaza is that it would be an extremely good idea if the inhabitants of Gaza could please go somewhere else. So, what have we seen? Well, we've started with non-Jewish Christian Zionism, and that is still around, it's still alive. Initially it started in England. Nowadays, it is most powerfully represented in the United States, and it is a significant enough number of people for US politicians to need to think about. We have our three original Zionisms have become four, and most importantly, the secular socialist Zionism, now called Labour Zionism, and the revisionist Zionism have swapped places in terms of importance. The liberal Zionism tends to come second after Likud in elections, which is why I put it second on the list on the right. But actually, in terms of political influence, some people would argue that it's really religious Zionism that matters. So, what would Theodor Herzl, inventor of Zionism, think of the situation today? I think he would be delighted that his plan for establishing a Jewish state had worked quite so well. But he would be a bit uncertain about some of the directions it has moved in. He wanted the Jews to be a normal people. And whether the Israelis are a normal people today, given the militarization of life in Israel, is an open question. He wanted a Jewish state that was democratic. Whether today's Israel can be described as democratic or not is an open question. And he also envisaged a secular Jewish state. So the position of Smotrich, he would be completely astonished by and probably not terribly enthusiastic. Well, I've gone 5 minutes over time, for which I apologize, but I hope I have given us a basis for a discussion and also a basis for understanding what's going on at present, because I think it's